So my topic today is Silicon Valley, and I want to start out by saying I'm a rather rare thing in Silicon Valley these days. I'm a native. Back when I was a kid, we called it the Santa Clara Valley, and before then, it was called the Valley of Heart's Delight, named for the beautiful apricot orchards that were everywhere in my childhood. Before it became known as the Global Technology Center, the Valley was once the largest producer of fruit in the world. Stanford, where I was lucky to go to school, is still known as the farm, but it really did look like one then. Most of my classmates in elementary school had parents who worked for companies like IBM and the young Hewlett-Packard company. And as many of you who were in business know, HP, Varian, Fairchild Semiconductor, and others were the predecessors of today's Apple, Google, Facebook, Twitter, and a bunch of companies none of us have heard of yet. The term Silicon Valley didn't even come into use until the 1980s, but by then, the Valley was already a center of global innovation, born from technological know-how, from a young venture capital network, and the institutional leadership of great universities like Stanford. It's always attracted dreamers and iconoclasts, people who like to play with technology, but more importantly, with new ideas. In the last 50 years, the Valley's become not only the home of some of the world's largest and most successful companies, but the subject of some global fascination, a little bit of envy, a lot of skepticism, some resentment, even a little bit of satire. Maybe some of you next-geners know this HBO show that it is a terrific send-up of Silicon Valley, and for those of you who haven't seen it, you might enjoy it. But my topic today is not the impact of the Valley on technology or business, but on innovations in the field of philanthropy. I want to talk about what those have been, how they came about, and what lessons we can apply from our experiences that might be relevant to you here in Australia and beyond. So for most of the last century, philanthropy in America was centered within about a 40-block radius in Manhattan, and some of you might recognize this old cartoon from The New Yorker. It was dominated by names like Ford and Carnegie and Rockefeller. These foundations were created by the leading industrialists of the last century, many of whom had, needless to say, long since passed on. But by mid-century, we began to see a shift in the philanthropic center of gravity westward, with the early creation of foundations by Hewlett and Packard. At the bottom on the right, you'll see Packard and Bill Hewlett and his wife, the Gates Foundation, there's Bill and Melinda, and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation in 2000. By then, more than half of the country's largest foundations were based on the West Coast. When we consider how big the American philanthropic sector is, we're talking $335 billion in annual giving, more than 1 million nonprofits, 80,000 foundations, 100 million volunteers and donors, with nonprofits accounting for almost $2 trillion in economic activity and nearly 10% of the American workforce. This shift was profound. And along with it would come the growing influence of new thinking from a very different breed of donors, most of whom were relatively young and certainly very much alive. So how could this community become engaged? How could established leaders in philanthropy teach them? What could they teach us? And how could we tap into the best of what the Valley had to offer? In 2001, I was recruited by the Hewlett Foundation to create this donor education program that Amanda spoke of called the Philanthropy Workshop West, a bit of a mouthful. It was designed to provide experiential, hands-on training for this new group of donors. And my own background was similar in that I had had a 20-year career in law practice and in business. I'd been the general counsel of a large scientific research organization, and I'd spent 20 years working with business people from the Valley. So for a decade, I educated over 100 ultra-high net worth donors, teaching them about issues, bringing in experts to talk to them about trends and new opportunities, taking them on field trips all around the world, and helping them to develop strategies in their areas of interest. For the last 5 years, I've run my own business and have helped also teach philanthropy at Stanford. So this experience has given me a front row seat to the growth of new philanthropy in Silicon Valley. I've learned how new donors become engaged, what's required to meet them on their terms, and how to inspire them. And I know here in Australia there's real momentum in philanthropy as well, with much more to come. And so with that in mind, I'd like to share 10 ideas about what I've learned that might be of interest to you. And while certainly the scale of philanthropy in the United States is obviously larger than is here, I think many of the lessons are actually quite transferable. The first point I want to make is that the growth in Silicon Valley of philanthropy has been a very slow and steady effort over the last decade. In the late 1990s, we saw companies like Amazon and Microsoft and Cisco beginning to explode, and with that, those business leaders beginning to think about philanthropy for the first time. By 2001, the field was rife with experiments about how to engage those donors. These ranged from a philanthropy incubator that would co-house new donors together so they could learn from each other, to giving circles, exemplified by groups like Social Venture Partners, which came originally from Seattle, or the Silicon Valley Social Venture Fund called SV2. Some of the Valley's leading venture capitalists created a philanthropic venture fund called Legacy Venture, where the investment proceeds would be dedicated to philanthropy. And the first Global Philanthropy Forum was held at Stanford in recognition of the fact that the Valley itself was becoming quite global and that we should be deeply exploring international giving. So it was a pretty heady time, but I will tell you that it was not always easygoing. I can remember some early meetings with several tech CEOs who were convinced they didn't need any kind of training in philanthropy. I mean, how hard could it be to give away money if you had founded and launched and taken public a company in a couple of years? A few of them were convinced that they could revolutionize education in rural villages in Africa simply by giving some kids some laptops, or that microcredit would be a silver bullet that would eliminate global poverty in a decade, maybe half that. Many business leaders were confident that private capital could do what decades of philanthropy and government work couldn't. Others criticized the East Coast philanthropy as too bureaucratic, too slow, certainly not in sync with how the world was changing. Even the word philanthropy made a lot of these folks nervous. But for all of that, there were many who saw themselves as fortunate to have made more money than they could use in their lifetimes, who were in fact surprised by their new wealth. Many of them made great fortunes not because they set out to get rich, but because they wanted to change the world with new ideas. And the companies that they formed became wildly successful in a shockingly short amount of time. One of my young students was a brilliant engineer from Google, said to me, "I was hit by a golden meteor." He and others like him were determined to use their new wealth wisely, and they recognized they had a lot to learn from what came before, although they might have a couple of new ideas up their sleeves as well. So over the next decade, we saw a remarkable growth of philanthropy in Silicon Valley. The Global Philanthropy Forum is still going strong. We've now got programs in Brazil and Africa. Legacy Ventures, the venture fund, now operates nationally, is opening in China. The Stanford Center on Philanthropy, where I have a position, as does Lucy Bernholtz, who you'll meet later, has a global reach, and the Stanford Social Innovation Review is largely considered the journal of record. The Silicon Valley Community Foundation has $4.7 billion under management, and in 2012, they made grants to 30 countries. So a number of efforts failed, to be sure, like the Philanthropy Incubator, but a surprising number succeeded, and they've left a global footprint and the scaffolding upon which the philanthropic sophistication and innovation can grow. So why did this happen? My second lesson is that foundations and existing donors put a lot of resources into this effort over a very long time. And a lot of credit goes to those foundations who realized that it was important to incubate and underwrite ventures to teach new donors. The program I ran was a partnership between Rockefeller, who had been around for 100 years, the Hewlett Foundation, who then was pushing 50, and a brand new foundation called TOSA that was created by John Morgridge, who was the chairman of Cisco. Some efforts were funded by venture capital, but I think it's important to emphasize that a surprising number had the intellectual and financial support of the established philanthropy community, who recognized it was important to invest in the field of philanthropy itself. Individual local leaders were active too, though, and they played an important role in engaging rookie donors. A good example is Tipping Point, and I know that Daniel Lurie, who was the founder of Tipping Point, was here last year. Tipping Point operates essentially as a pooled vehicle for younger donors who want to support anti-poverty programs in the Bay Area. And Dan is a young next-genner whose family has a 3-generational history in philanthropy in the San Francisco region. He created this fund along with a number of other families from San Francisco who were already part of the scene. And the idea was to provide a reliable one-stop shop for newer donors who were just getting into the game and didn't have either the time or the expertise to do the research themselves. The organization is fun and irreverent. They take their work but not themselves seriously. They have absolutely the best fundraisers every year that are always innovative and offbeat. But they're deeply rigorous in their due diligence, and it's brought them some notable success. The other thing I want to say is that we've seen a real culture change, and culture matters. People like Bill Gates have made it cool to be involved in philanthropy. And certainly he alone has had an enormous impact on the psyche of American business leaders, especially when he says that philanthropy is both fun and harder to do than anything he's ever done. That's something. My third lesson is that some of the most innovative new philanthropists are really just now coming into their prime after a long period of study and reflection, and they're taking on some really tough issues. The 11th Hour Project was created by Wendy and Eric Schmidt. He's the chairman of Google. And it's an important new foundation that's working in the area of climate change. The Pisces Foundation is the family foundation of Bob and Randy Fisher of the Gap family. They're also now just launching some major new initiatives in climate change policy. What's important is that each of these donors invested the time to explore issues that were not immediately on their radar screens. And their focus developed slowly and carefully by talking with experts who expose them to ideas and strategies that on their own it would have taken decades to learn about, if at all. I'll talk a little later on about the importance of having time to learn and study, but like former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, these donors are part of a new breed of business leaders who are tackling parts of some of the biggest and most complicated issues of our time, like climate change, inspiring others to do the same. They're willing to try a lot of ideas and to risk and fail, but they're inspiring others to take risks as well and really think big. That leads me to my fourth lesson, which is that a lot of philanthropy in the Valley really is a breed all of its own. So here we have Jeff Skoll and Pierre Omidyar, who are the co-founders of eBay. Both of them have established philanthropic institutions that have blurred the distinction between the for-profit and the nonprofit worlds. Pierre Omidyar, after a couple of years of operating within traditional foundation boundaries, decided to create something called the Omidyar Network, a philanthropic investment firm whose philosophy of funding was actually form agnostic. The premise was pretty simple. He wanted to fund whoever could get the job done, whether it was a for-profit company or a hybrid vehicle or a nonprofit or just somebody who had a great idea. In the beginning, this idea shocked the philanthropy establishment. But a decade later, his ideas have become mainstream. And this leads me to my fifth lesson, which is that other Valley leaders have taken little-known ideas and brought them to scale in record time. So we also have here Jeff Skoll. Jeff also rejected traditional ideas about funding in certain philanthropic silos. Instead, he adopted as a guiding principle the concept of social entrepreneurship. Now, this wasn't his original idea. A man named Bill Drayton, who founded an organization called Ashoka, is credited for launching this idea way back in 1980. But Skoll very intentionally decided to take this idea and put it on the map. And so he used television and film and scholarship and an annual gathering that happens every year in Oxford called the Skoll World Forum to advance this idea. And thanks in part to the work he's doing, the concept of social entrepreneurship is now something that's really understood globally. Skoll's also created a constellation of companies, from his investment company Capricorn to a film company, Participant Films. You've probably seen a number of them films like Good Night and Good Luck, and others that take on socially relevant issues, as well as a new global threats fund. So he has a constellation of companies that are trying to work together to advance issues across multiple fields. Another innovation that's taken hold in the last decade is the growth of hybrid business models. Some of the earliest experiments came from groups in the Bay Area like Pacific Community Ventures and the Roberts Enterprise Development Fund, which was started by George Roberts from Colbert Kravis Roberts, launched in the late 1990s. These were early ideas about how you could combine business to create jobs and work in companies that had some combination of for-profit and nonprofit status. Groups like Benetech, who was started by literally a rocket scientist in Palo Alto 25 years ago, experimented with creating social enterprises, including starting with a reading machine for the blind. And year after year, they keep creating more hybrid companies by licensing the technology or selling off one to launch another. Well, once this idea was viewed with huge skepticism, I mean, could you have a for-profit and a nonprofit under the same umbrella? Now it's actually considered mainstream. It's the new darling of Stanford Business School students who see little conflict between pursuing business profit and social impact. And we can see this in new organizations like Embrace and World of Good. Hybrid models are hard to manage, that's to be sure, but they're now being created all over the world with seed money, a lot of it coming from the Valley. And they've captured the imagination of entrepreneurs and engaged them in philanthropy in ways that many traditional nonprofits haven't been able to do. Later today, you're going to hear from Mike Dorsey, who's an expert on impact investing, so I'm not going to say a lot about that here. What I want to simply say is that it again didn't begin in the Valley. The idea is several decades old, beginning actually with innovations at the Rockefeller Foundation and with East Coast foundations like Jesse Smith Noyce and F.B. Heron. But it's taken root in the Valley in a major way, with leadership from people like Omidyar and others, especially in the area of microfinance. Technology entrepreneurs, including people like Charlie and Lisa Kleisner, I know were also recently here. Hadn't heard about impact investing until they participated in the program I taught, but they represent many, many who've taken this idea to heart, who are out crusading about it around the globe and are committing to invest 100% of their corpus in impact investing. So to me, it's not an accident that visionary entrepreneurs would be drawn to visionary ideas in philanthropy, and that entrepreneurs who are used to building companies in record time would also be drawn to scaling and investing in new ideas. Remember the old Apple advertising campaign, Think Different? So before I move on to some of my other lessons, I want to just quickly share some ideas because I know there are many of you here in the audience who work with nonprofits about how you deal with entrepreneurial donors. And I wrote a short piece for the fundraising magazine here that you might want to take a look at. But just very quickly, you know, entrepreneurial donors want to know what's unique and potentially disruptive about your organization, meaning what's game-changing? What are you doing differently that's new or additive? They're often more inclined to want to fund startups or groups that are willing to scale, but even if you're not one of those, I think thinking about how to make a compelling case about your impact is really important. Many of them are digitally savvy, so it's really critical to be thoughtful about your social media. They want to understand how you talk about outcomes over a certain period of time, not just the activities you're engaged in, but how those activities have made a real difference in what you're interested in. And while many of them are drawn to things like hybrid investing, hybrid models and impact investing, they'll also want to hear a little bit about the sustainability of your programs over time. Finally, they talk a different language. Often they're not comfortable with traditional philanthropy lingo. And so I think it's important to think about how do you talk in kind of simple terms. Often it's helpful to have peer influence. Maybe you have a board member who can reach out to them and present what you do in language that's of the business world, like we heard this morning. And finally, many of them want to contribute their business expertise to a cause. It's not just their money. It's their time and their business savvy and their connections. So I think all of those are really important. So what have we been learning in the last decade? Well, my sixth lesson is that the Valley's learned to distinguish between short-term charity and longer-term philanthropy. and that goes beyond tech. The Valley's come to recognize that technology alone cannot solve global problems. It's just one tool to influence complex forces of change. In a remarkably candid speech to a number of business leaders in Silicon Valley way back in 2006, Bill Gates acknowledged how he first learned that first world technologies don't always have a place in less affluent communities. He talked of going to Soweto in 1997 with Microsoft to donate some computers in a community center. Well, the community center didn't have consistent sources of power. So the local groups rigged up an extension cord to a diesel generator just to get the computer up and running. But once the cameras and the press left, the generator was moved on to a more urgent task, the computer sat idle, and the community turned its attention back to more serious needs. So Gates was trying to tell us that we need to remember that technology needs to be simple and appropriate to local needs, and that often market and business solutions are inadequate without political engagement and reform. I'd say even the most ardent technologists in Silicon Valley now get this. Students are churning out solutions that are more simple and designed to function in communities that are far off the grid. But they're also learning that change happens slowly and through a combination of forces, not just tech fixes. Of course, technology can be a powerful force of good, and many entrepreneurs remain fascinated by how technology is used. But just because we're comfortable with a certain solution doesn't mean it's going to do the job by itself. And that leads me to my next point, which is that our mindsets are starting to change. A decade ago, many business leaders thought that the marketplace could solve things that nonprofits had failed at for decades. And the people on the nonprofit side looked at the business people and were really worried that those guys were going to come in and tell them what to do and how to run the show. Gradually, we've seen a real evolution in thinking on both sides. We see business leaders developing a growing appreciation for the intricate social challenges that many nonprofits are dealing with every day, and nonprofits welcoming business and technical savvy into their operations. We're also learning a lot about metrics. It's been a given in the Valley that good intentions are not enough, and that there are opportunity costs of investing in one group that doesn't really make a big impact on a problem. But we've also, with much emphasis on measurable outcomes, come to understand that those should not be disproportionately costly or burdensome. And we're becoming increasingly appreciative of the fact that there are great strategies and ideas that are worth investing in, even when the outcomes might not be readily measurable, predictable, or might be decades off. While the focus on measurable impact remains strong, I do see a greater shift to talking about risk and the importance of experimentation. And we heard about risk this morning. Faye Twersky, who used to head up the evaluation practice at Gates, wrote a wonderful piece that I commend to you in this month's Stanford Social Innovation Review. And she argued that foundations need to be less prescriptive, more open, and more willing to learn from others and to course correct as necessary. And that, it seems to me, is really consistent with the historic character of what made Silicon Valley great. The great entrepreneurs were the ones who were willing to experiment with unorthodox ideas, to try ideas other people thought were crazy, but still listen to others and iterate along the way. So philanthropy that's less focused on short-term predictive outcomes and more about taking risks and learning along the way, to me, is more in keeping with the Valley's innate character. And I have in my mind the opening line of that wonderful Think Different ad where Steve Jobs says, "Here's to the crazy ones." My eighth lesson is that the need to collaborate and share what we are learning is greater than ever. And one of the key lessons in philanthropy over the last decade is that nobody, not even Bill Gates, can do it alone. The problems are too big, and collaboration is essential, even though it's hard. And so what I was seeing at home, and I know you're seeing it here too, is a tremendous growth in the number of giving circles and collaborative due diligence. There's a wonderful new group in the Valley called Big Bang Philanthropy. It was started informally by some individuals and foundations, all of whom cared about global poverty issues and who shared some common grantees. And what they realized is not everybody could fly halfway around the world to go see certain organizations on the ground, and it'd be better if they could join forces and learn together. They're looking for the biggest bang for their buck, and I think it's an important idea. We're also seeing many of the more established foundations recognizing the power of individual donors and looking for partnership opportunities. Over 70% of American charitable dollars come from individual donors. Individual donors outnumber foundations 12 to 1. So what we're seeing is a greater interest in how foundations can share their knowledge with individual donors so everybody is not reinventing the wheel. And we're having an opportunity to share due diligence. As information about nonprofits comes online, it's also becoming increasingly vital for foundations to be more transparent and self-critical. And I know Brad will talk about this a little bit. We need to talk more about what we've tried that has failed and less about what the latest charity du jour is. If we don't, we run the risk of wasting resources and having others repeat our mistakes. And as a culture that thrives on innovation, we need to watch our tendencies to always want to fund the new thing. Sometimes the hottest nonprofit is not the one, may not be the one that's doing the most critical work on an issue. And with social media increasingly driving giving, we need to be aware that nonprofits who have compelling social media messages sometimes can disproportionately command donor support over less media-savvy organizations that are breaking some new ground. So my ninth lesson is that we need to learn to inspire new philanthropy that's coming online. And here you see Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg from Google. We're seeing a seismic shift with the creation of massive new wealth by new entrepreneurs. And they're the subject of extraordinary attention, as you can imagine. Everybody wants a little bit of their wealth. To be sure, many of them are already putting significant sums into philanthropy. Zuckerberg gave the largest gift last year of $1 billion of Facebook stock. But the mismatch between the expectations of their readiness and the needs is quite striking. And this is exacerbated by the fact that the numbers of nonprofits in the United States has close to doubled in the last decade. We have over 1,000 nonprofits in Silicon Valley alone, and everybody wants a little bit of this new money. There are just too many groups that are chasing that money to be funded. So we have a tremendous need and an opportunity here in the next decade to work with new donors like this, but also give them space to learn and grow. And I know you're committed to this as well. I had the pleasure of meeting a number of your next-gen donors who came to the United States a year ago, and I was so impressed by how well prepared they are and how much they're committed to learning. So my 10th and last lesson is that philanthropy is a long game, and we need to think long-term. There are a lot of debates going on in the Valley right now about whether our giving is keeping pace with our wealth creation and whether technology companies are giving at a level that's consistent with their newfound wealth. And there are growing divides in our country between rich and poor that are making these debates very important ones. But if we look at the history of philanthropy, we recognize it's a long game. Even Henry Frick, who was a contemporary of Carnegie, made his money in the 1880s, but he didn't begin his philanthropy until 1910, over 30 years later. And many of our established philanthropy leaders in the US are saying, look, failing fast might be a great mantra for technology, but social change takes years. And the most effective donors are the ones who have the long view, who are patient, and have the time to think long-term about big, complicated problems where the results might not be seen for decades. So the role of these millennials evokes conflicting opinions. On the one hand, we want them to give away a lot of money right now. On the other hand, we want them to take their time and learn. So we need two things. We need leaders like Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard who became deeply committed to philanthropy relatively early in their careers and encouraged others to do the same. But we also need to remember that this is a long game and it's really hard to do it well, and that time and money educating yourself and learning and studying and analyzing and being willing to take on deep, complicated issues is really important. A really positive trend is I see a lot of these young donors putting money into donor-advised funds, sitting on boards, joining groups, funding research, launching crowdfunding campaigns, as I'm sure you do here, and it's exciting to hear about all the work that's going on. What we're seeing is that philanthropy is becoming more democratized, more broadly discussed. and no longer do people think philanthropy Rockefeller. We still have a lot of debates unfolding. How much money should be invested locally versus globally? How do environmental, arts, and cultural causes and international priorities stack up against education, which is what garners the largest amount of money in the Valley right now? Are the wealthy stepping up and giving to their capacity, or at least becoming more engaged? And can philanthropy address the growing gap between the very rich and the rest of our society? These are tough debates that we need to have. So, some quick closing thoughts, and here they are, my top 10. A, it's important to invest in the field of philanthropy. 2, educating yourself and educating others is key. Leadership is critical. We've had Bill Gates, we've had Bill Hewlett, Dave Packard. We need more and more, as I'm sure you feel here too. Questioning authority is important. That's how new ideas come in. Begging and borrowing and stealing other people's ideas and scaling them up is great. Being willing to iterate is critical. Great philanthropy is focused and nimble. Collaboration is huge. We need to mix it up, bring the best of old thinking and new thinking. It's not just about innovation and scaling new ideas, it's also about investment in the long game. And second, we need to inspire others to act. Finally, we need to debate. On and on. It's critical and it's important. Great ideas come from everywhere. It's a pleasure to be here. You were earlier on invited to come to Canada. I want you to come visit us in the Valley of Heart's Delight. Thank you.